exciting opportunity. As we enter into the holiday season, which I guess we are now technically in, we do some exciting things to love on our community and world right here where we are. And one of the things that we do to love on our community and world is we collect shoe boxes for Operation Christmas Child. Kids around the world receive these boxes with items in them, with toys, I don't think food. No food. That would be my choice, I guess. But school supplies, different fun things that get to be a part of this. If you would like more information about what all needs to go in your box, you can check it out in the lobby directly behind you as soon as we're done today. Not right now, but as soon as we're done today. I would encourage you to go back there. We have some boxes that you can take with you and prepare. And 2 weeks from today, we want you to bring your boxes, and I assume boxes, because why would you do just one, right? I assume you're going to do like 20 or 30 of these things. Don't take that many today. We'll have more next week too. But take a few of these boxes, go and prepare this list. You can choose a boy or a girl box. I think that's still the way that they do it. And you have the opportunity to send some love to a kid, a family, all the way around the world. So make sure that you stop by the lobby directly behind you immediately after we are done here today. Everybody good? Fantastic. Now, we are in a series called 30-Minute Theology. And before you get scared by this title, theology simply means studying God. It's the study of God, and that's what we're going to do for the next 4 weeks or so, the next 3 weeks or so, right up until Thanksgiving. Does it seem like Thanksgiving should be just like 2.5 weeks away? No, it's like, when did November even start? Don't say 4 days ago. I know it was 4 days ago, but it just doesn't feel like it should have started yet. But we're right there. So we're going to go all the way right up to Thanksgiving with this, and we're just going to be studying some of the attributes of God, the characteristics of God. And what's so cool is that no matter how much you think you know about God, guess what? You can always learn more. You can always grow more. And there have been people, this is so cool, there have been people throughout history that have experienced a relationship with God. There were some people that even got to hear God's audible voice. Isn't that crazy? And they took that experience that they had with God and they wrote down everything that they learned about Him. And they distributed these documents all over the place. And then there were some other people that they actually got to meet with Jesus face to face. They got to talk to Him, hang out with Him, interact with Him. And they got to see Him do some crazy things, some miracles. And then they went and they wrote down everything that they experienced in their relationship with the Son of God. And then they walked away from that and they put this all together a few hundred years later into this thing that we call the Bible. And we get to experience and learn a little bit more about who God is because of what they experienced and what they wrote down. And plus we can look at nature, we can look at creation all around us, and we can learn more about who God is and how we get to be in a relationship with Him based on who He is. And listen, people for literally thousands of years have been writing this down. They've written thousands of books about this subject, about learning who God is, and they have spent their entire lives devoted to this subject. But I figure that you guys are so advanced, all we need is 30 minutes before Sundays. And we are going to be able to take care of all of this. So, last week we jumped right in with kind of an easy one to get started with. We talked about the idea that God is love. And today I kind of want to do something different. Now, this is the thing that honestly so many people struggle with. Matter of fact, when I was kind of a brand new Christian and just figuring this thing out, I struggled with this subject. And if there's probably one subject that maybe frustrates more people or causes more people to stay away from Christianity, it is probably this. So if week 1 we talked about how God is love, it's not just what He does, it's who He is. In week 2 we have to talk about the wrath of God. Right? It only makes sense that we go from one extreme to the other. Now, I was expecting you guys to all be excited when we said we were going to talk about the wrath of God. But of course you're not excited, because who gets excited about that? Because this is the one area that we kind of struggle with that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, because in a lot of ways the whole system really just doesn't seem fair. Right? If you guys could mute the computer back there, that would be extremely helpful.
It's muted.
It's muted. Everybody hold still. Time out. This isn't happening.
Well done.
I'm in. So if you guys would understand that this whole system just doesn't seem fair to me, at least when I was just figuring this thing out, it just didn't seem fair because it was kind of like the wrath. And by the way, the word wrath just means like extreme anger, really angry. And to me, the whole system just kind of didn't make sense, and it fell apart because it was kind of like, let's pretend there's a person that's on their deathbed, and it was kind of like God would look at them and be like, haha, you didn't repent, you didn't follow Jesus, and they would be like, well, I didn't even hear Jesus' name, and he would be like, tough cookies, in Latin or something. And the whole thing just didn't seem to make sense to me, and I didn't understand why God could be a God who is love, and who is compassionate and graceful, and also a God who is wrathful, who's angry all the time. And it didn't make sense. And some of you, maybe your picture of Jesus growing up was very, very different. It was the flannel graph Jesus where he was holding a lamb or feeding kids or doing something really nice. And then you grew up a little bit and you actually went and you read the Old Testament and you were like, oh my goodness, I can't believe God did that. I can't believe that he acted that way. God, did you know what you did? I can't believe you would do something like that. And it blew your mind. And then you went and read the New Testament and you're like, well, it gets a little bit nicer here, but oh my goodness, I still can't believe some of the things that you're going to do. This is unbelievable. And it kind of blew your mind. And then you look around and you see all the things that are going on in and around the world. And you say to yourself, I'm not quite sure I understand this God who on one side we say is love, and on one side is incredibly angry, has an anger issue. And so, how do we reconcile that? What does that really look like, and what does that mean? And if you're a person that struggles with this, you're not alone. There was a kind of famous modern thinker. His name is Bertrand Russell. He wrote a book called Why I'm Not a Christian. If you want to check that out. And basically, he came away with this thought. He said, the reason that I could never be a Christian, the reason that I could never be a Jesus follower is because Jesus believed in the wrath or the extreme anger of God. And he said that is his one big character defect, is that he believed in God's wrath. And honestly, for so many of us in the room, if we could take an eraser and we could erase something out of the Bible, it would probably be this subject. It would probably be the subject of how angry God can be and how wrathful he can be. But honestly, we really can't do that. Because even though it is a tough attribute and a tough characteristic for us to understand, it is absolutely essential to our relationship with him. As a matter of fact, to put it a little bit different, a God without wrath would be a God without goodness. A God without wrath would be a God without goodness. And let me show you what I mean by that. Exodus chapter 33 and 34, if you have your Bible, we're going to see that in just a minute. But let me kind of set the stage for you. Moses is the leader of Israel, and he is leading the people out of Egypt, where they've been enslaved for hundreds of years. And there's this whole story about how God said, let my people go, and all this stuff. And Pharaoh, who was kind of like the king of Egypt, didn't want it to happen because they were free labor. And eventually, they got out of Egypt, and they went, and they were traveling along the road. And along the way, Moses looked at God and said, I want you to show me you in all of your glory, in all of your goodness. Will you just show me your face? Because, it's kind of like sometimes when you're talking to God, it's kind of like you would like to be able to see. And so Moses wanted to see God's face. And so God says these words to him in Exodus chapter 33:19. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness, all of me, to pass in front of you. And I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. So, in other words, Moses, yes. And then, fast forward one chapter to Exodus 34, verse 5. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Sounds really wrathful, doesn't it? Maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellions, and sin. I mean, that sounds horrible, right? And then he goes on to say this, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children, and their children for the sin of their parents to the third and fourth generation. Now this sets up one of the biggest contradictions in the entire Bible. Matter of fact, people have walked away from all of this because they could not reconcile these two things. How could there be on one side a God who is loving and compassionate, slow to anger, and then on this other side, a God who says, I will punish the children for crying out loud. I will punish for the sins of parents to the third and fourth generation. How can you have those two things coexist? Well, I'm glad you asked, but I'm not going to tell you just yet. I'm going to make you wait for it just a few minutes. But what I want to do, I believe that this passage and this story, we'll look at a little bit more of it too. I believe that this passage, this story, perfectly explains the wrath of God and what it means in our lives. And I want to be able to tell you kind of six things, six kind of guide points for us to be able to fully understand this. And they kind of build off of each other. So the first thing I want you to understand about God's wrath is this. God's wrath exists. His anger exists. A lot of people want to take it away and say, you know what, I don't like that part of God, so I'm only going to focus on this part of God, but I need you to understand that that's dangerous. That's incredibly dangerous, and it only is going to hurt you in the long run. You ever know, you know how many times God's anger, God's wrath is talked about in the Bible by the people who wrote the Bible? You know how many times they bring it up? Over 600 times. Over 600 times. This is something that is serious. You ever around somebody who is angry all the time? Of course you are. You all live in New York. Of course you are. You ever around somebody, though, that you know, somebody in your life that it just kind of seems angry? Husbands and wives, stop pointing at each other. Somebody that just seems angry all the time. Of course you are. Check out this verse I was reading this week, Psalm 7:11. It says that God is a righteous judge, a God who displays his what? How often?
Every day.
Every day. In other words, God is kind of like a New Yorker. He's angry every day. This kind of floored me. I was kind of like, and it's not just that he's angry, but he displays. Like there are some people that can be angry and you'll never know it. But God displays his wrath every single day. And you may think, you know, that was just an Old Testament thing and that God got nicer in the New Testament. But I'm here to tell you that love is actually a dominant theme in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But God's wrath, his anger, is also a dominant theme in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Jesus talked about God's wrath often. Often. Matter of fact, it was one of his most visited conversations. He said it like this, John 3:36. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. But whoever rejects the Son will not see life. For God's what? Wrath remains on them. And not only did he talk about it, but at least one occasion he displayed it. You guys remember there was this one time where there were these people that were buying and selling animals out in front of the temple. And Jesus came and he got so mad because they were making a mockery of the worship system. You were supposed to bring your first fruit from your farm, from whatever you did, and offer it to God. But people were taking all these animals and they were selling them right there in the temple court so that they could go in and make a sacrifice with an animal that wasn't even theirs that they had just bought off the street. And Jesus said, you're making a mockery of the whole temple worship system. So he made a whip, Indiana Jones style, and he attacked these people who were buying and selling in the temple. Could you imagine Jesus doing that?
No.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to us with our friendly, always happy version of Jesus, but Jesus got really mad. And not only did he get really mad, but the actual reason that he was crucified, it wasn't because he talked about God's love all the time. It was because he talked about God's wrath towards the people who were hypocritical and unjust to the people around them, meaning the religious leaders. That's what got him crucified. So Jesus believed that this exists, that he existed, that God's wrath existed, and it's actually what got him crucified. So don't skip over that. God's wrath does exist, which leads me to number 2. And this is the harder one for us to understand, but God's wrath is actually an expression of his goodness. You remember what Moses asked God to see? I want to see all of you. I want to see all of your glory, all of your goodness pass in front of me. Well, he did. And what he talked about in that moment wasn't just how gracious and compassionate he was. He actually talked about how angry he would be to the third and fourth generation. His extreme anger grows out of his love and compassion. That doesn't make a lot of sense maybe, but let me try to explain it. Any parents in the room? Doesn't matter how old your kids are. Any parents there? Okay, a few. As a parent, if you love your children, and I hope you do, you don't want to tolerate things that will be harmful to them in their lives. And if you were tolerant of those things, it's not very loving. Like for example, if your child was like a pathological liar at the age of 3, and I think they all are. If your child is a pathological liar at the age of 3, you don't want to take that behavior and encourage it. You don't want to just let it go. You want to correct it. You want to change it. And inside you may get a little angry when your 3-year-old lies to you. I remember getting angry. I still get angry when a kid lies to me. And I say to myself, I'm not going to show this anger, but I want to correct this so that they don't continue down this path. If your child was a thief, hopefully you wouldn't just be like, hey, steal something for me too next time. Hopefully you'd go a different direction than that. And you would want to change this behavior within them because you love them. You love them. Even though you got angry, even though you were frustrated, maybe even you were extremely angry, you want to change this behavior in you because you know that ultimately it will harm them. And listen to me, I need you to understand this. When we talk about God's anger, his extreme anger, his wrath, he's not angry just at you as an individual. He is angry at your sin. He's angry at your rebellion. He is angry at the thing that separates you from him. One of the best descriptions of this, and listen, he knows that sin and rebellion actually destroy you. They unravel you, and he knows this. One of the best descriptions of this was found just a few chapters before this moment that we just read in Exodus, where Moses had asked Pharaoh, kind of the king of Egypt, to let the people go, and guess what Pharaoh said?
No.
He said, no. One of you got it. No. He said, no, you can't go. And it said that his heart was hard, which meant that he was just stubborn. He was not moving. He was a rock. And then God decided that he was going to send these things called plagues to convince Pharaoh that he was going to let those people go. And I used to think, and maybe you think, that these plagues were just kind of a random series of events to show God's power. But actually it wasn't. If God wanted to show his power, he could have just given Moses Jedi powers and choked Pharaoh out, right? Or he could have just turned all of his soldiers into ants and he could have squashed them. But no, this wasn't about God just showing his power. I think he wanted to show everybody, Israel and Egypt, what happened when you lived in rebellion and sin in your life. He wanted to show them what would happen, that creation would unravel. And so the first thing that he did, you guys remember what it was? He took the Nile River, which was the way of life for all these Egyptian people. It's where they got everything from. And he turned it into blood. He completely destroyed an entire ecosystem. Then what happened? A bunch of frogs came. And they went everywhere. Where do frogs live?
In the water.
In the water. Guess where they couldn't go?
In the water.
In the water. Creation was destroyed. And all of a sudden now all these frogs. And then from frogs came all these gnats. And then from gnats came all these diseases. And it's this natural order of things that shows you that when you let rebellion and sin go unchecked in your life, it leads to a place. It leads to an unraveling in your life. In Genesis chapter 1, God kind of came to the place where he created order out of chaos. But when we let sin and rebellion go unchecked in our life, it creates chaos out of order every single time. And you have probably experienced that at some point in your life. And God didn't intend for it to go that way. And so when God gets angry at the sin and the injustice in the world, at the evil in the world, it's not because he's just angry at you and wants to be mean. It actually is an expression of his goodness. And you may ask the question, well, couldn't God just get rid of all the evil in the world and we wouldn't have to worry about this? If God could just, and we believe he can, if God could just flip a switch and get rid of all the evil and all the injustice in the world, why doesn't he just do it? Well, I asked this question a couple years ago. If you had the power, if you had that button, if you had that switch, and you could just get rid of injustice and evil in the entire world, would you flip that switch? And before you answer yes or no, ask yourself a question. Have you ever done anything evil? Is there anything potentially evil within you? Within your kids? Has your spouse ever done anything evil? Mine is perfect in every way, but has your spouse ever done anything evil? If you have a reason to maybe not push that button, do you think that God maybe has a reason not to push that button? I think he does. It's because his anger is an expression of his goodness. One theologian put it like this. He said, God's anger is his unrelenting, uncompromising, and steadfast antagonism toward evil and injustice in all its forms. It is an expression of his goodness. Moving on to 3, or we're never going to get done with this. God's wrath often consists of letting us experience consequences. Remember where it talked about how he was going to hold them accountable to the 3rd and 4th generation? We know from other places in Scripture that you're not going to be punished for what your parents do, like eternally. But let's put it like this. If I were to, I don't even know how I would do this, but if I were to like embezzle money tomorrow from the church and get fired, do you think my children would be affected by this if I went to prison?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. If you had an affair on your spouse and you decided to leave them tomorrow, do you think that that would affect your children?
Yes.
Yes. Maybe even your children's children might be affected by that decision in your life. And so I think the consequences of our rebellion, the consequences of our sin, we get to feel those. And it's also an extension of God's grace and mercy in our life. Letting us experience the consequences of our choices is what theologians call passive wrath. Everybody say passive wrath.
Passive wrath.
It's a good word to learn. Active wrath would be like you embezzle money, God hits you with a lightning bolt. Boom. Doesn't happen very often. But passive wrath means that he lets you experience the pain of your choices, the misery sometimes of your choices, trying to convince you and show you that he wants a relationship with you. So sometimes God's wrath consists of letting us experience the consequences of our choices. And then, number 4, God chose to let his love overcome his wrath. God chose to let his love, his compassion for you overcome his anger. Check this out, Exodus 34:7 again. It says that he maintains love to thousands. And really, this is a Hebrew poem, by the way. I know you guys probably picked up on that when we read it the first time. This is a Hebrew poem. And the word generations should have been in here, according to most scholars, that he maintains love to thousands of generations. And forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. So exponentially, he focuses on his compassion and forgiveness, like 250 times more at least than he does his anger. And it says this phrase in here, slow to anger. Slow to anger. You know what that really means? I'll give you the exact definition of it here in just a few minutes. But what it really means is that he brought his compassion near and he pushed his anger distant. He felt 2 very right emotions in this moment. Anger and compassion. And understand this. In that moment, he chose to bring one near and push the other far away. When he had every right to push us out forever. Peter, who was a follower of Jesus, he would later write about this, and he says that decision, it actually confused the angels. That they were baffled by that moment when he chose to bring compassion toward us instead of anger and punishment. Paul would write it like this in the New Testament. He wrote, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son." It wasn't even just that we were wayward children that he brought back. No. It says that we were enemies. That's not like bringing your kid back in after they've done something wrong. That would be like you going to find a terrorist camp somewhere in the world that wanted you murdered and asking them to live in your house. It says that we were enemies of God, and yet he brought us back. Which leads me to number 5. We can escape God's wrath only through Christ. Remember that contradiction I told you about earlier? The one that said on one side he wants to forgive and get rid of the wickedness and rebellion and sin, but on the other hand, he cannot leave the guilty unpunished. How many of you are guilty of ever being wicked, sinful? Everybody should raise your hand. If you're not, you're a liar right now. Now you can raise your hand. Okay, great. If that's true, if God cannot let the sin and the wickedness go unpunished, this is a contradiction, but you guys know what the resolution, the answer to that contradiction is? It's Jesus. How can God forgive sin and not let sin go unpunished? It was that Jesus took the punishment for your wickedness on himself. He stood in on your behalf, and he felt every drop of God's extreme anger, every drop of his wrath towards you that was deserving, because you were rebellious, you were sinful, you were wicked. But Jesus stood in that place instead, and he took every single drop of that anger. And now it says that he stands at the right hand of God, sits at the right hand of God as an advocate for you. You know what that means? I think that when I picture this, it's like God can look down and he can see you and all of your guilt and all of your shame and all of your wickedness, everything that you've ever done. But Jesus is there to remind him, we don't want to punish him twice for that. You've already poured all of your anger and all of your wrath out, but you did it on me, and I took it for them. You have an advocate that is sitting there, reminding God that the punishment was already satisfied, that his wrath was already satisfied through him. Which leads me to number 6, and you're going to love this one. God's wrath still comes, slowly but surely. It says that he's slow to anger. You guys know what that phrase really means in Hebrew? I'm sure you all do, but let me remind you. It means long of nostrils.
What?
Long of nostrils. What happens when you become angry? Your nostrils flare. And literally, the way that they understood this was that God was slow to let his nostrils flare. I'm not making this up. No, I'm being serious. Slow to let his nostrils flare. Some of us are quick to let our nostrils flare. I think the reason that he's slow to anger and slow to wrath and slow to let these things come about is because he wants to have a relationship with you. And he waits till the very last moment to dish out his punishment and his wrath. People have mistaken God's slowness for absence for years. There was a guy named Noah in the Old Testament who God told him to build a boat, build an ark. You know how long it took between the time God told Noah to build a boat and the flood actually came? It was 100 years. It would probably take me 100 years to build a big boat too, but 100 years. And so I think what's so important for us to understand is that we don't need to set in this time where it seems like God's not angry at you for any of the wickedness or the decisions that you may have made in your life and assume that that means he's not wrathful, that he's not angry about it. Because I believe that he is. And I believe that our wickedness, our sin, separates us from God. It brings his wrath and his punishment on us. But we have been offered an escape through Jesus. If you will believe and repent and accept it. There was this really weird Supreme Court case back in 1830. Anybody around for that one?
No.
There was a guy named George Wilson who was found guilty of, basically admitted to theft and assault. Grand theft and assault. And in 1830, President Andrew Jackson issued a pardon to Wilson, but for reasons undisclosed and unknown, Wilson actually refused it. He refused the pardon. And the Supreme Court made this ruling. A pardon must be received be valid. It is an act of grace that cannot be forced. If unreceived, it is not valid. And I believe that there are many people in this world, maybe even some in this room, who are going to go to hell, which we believe is a real place, with their sins fully paid for, because they never accepted Jesus as their Savior. So here's what I want us to do to close today. If you would just stand with me. I want to pray with us, because we believe that God's wrath, His anger is a real thing. That He gets angry at sin. He gets angry at rebellion and wickedness. But you, right where you stand right now, you have an opportunity to be able to be forgiven. To be able to be made new. To be able to escape that punishment of that wrath, of that anger, through His compassion and grace. And so if you're here this morning and you have never experienced that compassion and that love in your life, this is your moment to accept it. Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. And God, for your word that speaks into our lives. God, your anger, your wrath about wickedness and injustice is real. We believe that you are an angry God. You're angry not just at us, but because of the sin and the wickedness that will unravel us. Your anger is born out of love for us. And so, God, I pray that for every single one of us in the room, that we would have, in the face of your anger and your wrath, that we would have experienced your compassion and your love, and that we would accept the grace that Jesus offers in our place. And God, if that has not been our experience before this moment, let none of us walk out of the room today without knowing that Jesus stood in our place and is our Savior, and we have repented of that wickedness and rebellion in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Have a great Sunday, everybody. We'll see you back next week at 9 or 10:30.